The morning air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of sharp chill that cut through even the thickest flannel. Jack Callahan stood on the porch of his small cabin, cradling a steaming mug of black coffee, his breath rising in ghostly tendrils against the backdrop of Rocky Mountain wilderness. The land stretched endlessly before him, a vast and untamed expanse where nature dictated the rules, and men like him learned to either abide by them or perish. Jack had spent the better part of his life in places like this, where the only sounds were the whispering of the wind through the fir trees and the distant calls of a red-tailed hawk gliding over the ridgeline. It was the life he had chosen, or, perhaps, the life that had chosen him. After his father's passing a decade ago, he had retreated further into the wild, carving out an existence that few would dare embrace. The cabin, built by his father's own hands, stood as a relic of a bygone era, its cedar walls weathered by years of brutal winters and relentless mountain storms. Inside, it was simple: a stone fireplace, a wooden table worn from years of use, and shelves lined with old hunting knives, tins of coffee, and a collection of well-thumbed books. Mounted above the hearth was his father's Winchester Model 70, the same rifle Jack had learned to shoot with when he was just a boy. It was more than just a weapon. It was a legacy, a symbol of the lessons passed down from one generation to the next. Jack had once lived for the hunt, for the quiet thrill of tracking a deer through fresh snowfall, for the steady pull of the trigger, for the way the world seemed to still in those fleeting seconds before the shot rang out. His father had taught him that hunting was not just about taking it, was about balance, about respect for the land and the creatures that roamed it. But lately, something had shifted. The weight of every kill lingered a little longer, settled a little heavier in his chest. He had started to wonder if the thrill had faded, or if he had simply grown weary of the silence it left behind. Outside, the sun crept higher over the mountains, casting long golden beams through the mist-laden forest. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed through the valley. Jack took another sip of coffee, his calloused fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. He had no use for town life anymore. People talked too much, asked too many questions. He preferred the company of the wild, where nothing was expected of him, except survival. The few times he ventured into Timber Ridge, the nearest town, it was only for supplies: a bag of coffee, a box of ammunition, the occasional bottle of whiskey, to keep the cold nights at bay. But solitude was a funny thing. It gave a man time to think, to reflect on the choices that had led him here. And lately, Jack had begun to feel the gnawing of something he couldn't quite name, something that made the vast wilderness seem a little less like freedom and a little more like a cage. He had no way of knowing it then, but everything was about to change. The call would come soon, the voice of Ranger Emily Carter crackling over the old rotary phone, pulling him back into a world he thought he had left behind. And with it, the first step toward a reckoning he never saw coming. Jack had just set his coffee mug down on the wooden table when the sound of the old rotary phone shattered the silence of the cabin. The damn thing hardly rang anymore. The last time it had, it was the hardware store in Timber Ridge, letting him know his bulk order of canned beans and coffee had arrived. Before that, it had been the ranger's office, checking in after a rough storm had torn through the valley. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his grizzled jaw, before stepping across the room. The phone sat on a small shelf near the fireplace, a relic from a time when his father still walked these floors. Jack lifted the receiver, pressing it to his ear. "Yeah?" His voice was gruff from the morning chill. A familiar voice cut through the static. Ranger Emily Carter. Young, sharp, and one of the few people in Timber Ridge Jack had any real respect for. She wasn't the type to waste time with small talk, which meant this call wasn't just for pleasantries. "Jack," she said, her tone measured. "Got something odd up near Black Creek. Thought you might want to take a look." Jack frowned, shifting his weight as he glanced out the window. The forest was still, save for the wind weaving through the towering firs. "What kind of odd are we talking about?" "A grizzly," she said. "A big one. She's been digging same spot for hours. Farmer Tom Weston called it in this morning. Swore she was at it all night. Said she won't leave. Won't eat. Just keeps tearing into the dirt like something's buried there." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. Black Creek was a good 5 miles north, past the ridge where the land dipped into thick undergrowth and rocky terrain. Bears weren't uncommon up there. But this This wasn't normal behavior. She aggressive? He asked. Emily hesitated. Not toward people. Tom didn't stick around long enough to find out, but he said she's acting frantic. Jack rubbed his temple. Frantic bears were dangerous bears. If she was sick, starving, or injured, she could be a real problem. And if she had cubs, that complicated things even more. Could be a carcass, he mused. Maybe she buried a kill and doesn't want to leave it. Maybe, Emily agreed. But this feels different. You've seen bears like this before? Jack had seen plenty of things in his time. Things that didn't always make sense at first. He'd seen a grizzly mourning its dead mate, refusing to leave its side for days. He'd seen a black bear that had been wounded by a poacher, dragging itself miles through the mountains just to die in the same den it was born in. But this? A bear digging relentlessly in one spot, refusing food, acting like something was buried that couldn't be left behind? No, he hadn't seen that before. I'll take a look, he said finally. Be careful, Emily warned. If she's protecting something, she won't think twice about going after you. Jack huffed a dry laugh. That's why you called me, isn't it? Emily didn't answer right away. Then, softer, yeah, it is. The line went dead. Jack hung up the phone, already moving. 15 minutes later, he was packed. A hunting knife strapped to his belt, a small pack with essentials slung over his shoulder, and a pair of binoculars hanging from his neck. He grabbed his rifle last, slinging it over his shoulder more out of habit than necessity. He'd learned long ago that being unarmed in the wild was an invitation for trouble. His boots crunched against frost-laden leaves as he stepped off his porch, moving toward the dense tree line. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The hike to Black Creek wasn't far, but the terrain was rough, steep inclines, thick brush, and loose shale that could send a man tumbling if he wasn't careful. Jack moved with practiced ease, his body instinctively navigating the land he had called home for years. The forest greeted him with its usual symphony, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, the scurry of squirrels darting between trees, the babbling of the cold, clear creek that cut through the valley. But something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. It was a stillness, a tension in the air, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Jack's boots hit the edge of Black Creek, just as Emily's Green Ranger truck pulled up along the dirt path. She stepped out, adjusting the radio clip to her belt. Her hazel eyes flicked toward him, sharp and observant. You made good time, she noted. Jack grunted. Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about. She nodded toward the tree line. She's just past those pines. I got close enough to see her, but not enough to spook her. She's still digging. Jack lifted his binoculars, scanning the clearing ahead. And there she was. A massive grizzly, her fur a mix of deep brown and golden hues, matted with dirt and clumps of moss. Her claws raked through the soil with relentless energy, flinging chunks of earth behind her. Jack lowered the binoculars. His gut tightened. This wasn't just a bear foraging for food. This was something else entirely. Emily shifted beside him. I don't think she's going anywhere. Jack nodded, his gaze locked on the bear. No, he murmured. I don't think she is. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The bear let out a low, guttural growl, the kind that sent shivers down a man's spine. And Jack? For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep in his bones. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. A sense of unease. A sense of purpose. Jack crouched low behind the thick trunk of a Douglas fir, his breath slow and steady as he observed the massive grizzly through the dense underbrush. The bear Cody, as he would later come to call her, was a formidable sight. Her fur, thick and rugged from years of survival in the wild, was matted with dirt and streaked with mud. She had been at this for hours, digging relentlessly, her powerful claws raking through the earth like a creature possessed. From this close, Jack could see the raw desperation in her movements. This wasn't mere foraging. She was frantic, restless. Something was driving her forward, something primal, something urgent. Beside him, Emily Carter whispered, her voice barely above the wind rustling through the pine needles. She hasn't stopped. Not once. Jack gave a slight nod, his eyes locked on the grizzly's every move. She's after something. Not food. Something else. Cody suddenly paused, her massive chest heaving. frosted breath curling into the cold air. Her ears twitched. Jack's muscles tensed. She knows we're here. The bear turned her great head in their direction, her dark eyes locking onto Jack's through the tangle of fallen branches and brush. A warning growl rumbled from her throat, low, deep, unmistakable. The kind of sound that sent a shiver through a man's bones. Jack didn't move. He had spent too many years in the wild to make a rookie mistake now. A sudden movement would turn her defensive posture into an attack. Emily's fingers hovered near the tranquilizer gun at her hip, but Jack raised a hand, signaling her to hold steady. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice calm, measured, barely above a whisper. He had no illusions. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and Cody could be on him in seconds. He'd seen firsthand what a grizzly could do to a man who didn't respect the boundaries of the wild. The bear huffed sharply, pawing at the ground. A test. A warning. One more step, and I'll remind you who owns this land. Jack had no intention of pushing her. Not yet. From where he knelt, he could now see the hole she had carved into the earth, deep enough that roots jutted out from the disturbed soil, a dark cavity gaping beneath her enormous paws. Something lay there. Jack's brow furrowed. "She's not just digging," he murmured. "She's looking for something." Emily glanced at him. Or protecting something. A flicker of realization passed through Jack's mind. A den. A cub. His pulse quickened. If Cody had a cub trapped down there, it explained everything. The digging, the agitation, the refusal to leave. Jack inhaled deeply, shifting his weight as slowly as he could. He knew what had to be done. "She's not just being territorial," he said. "She's in trouble." Emily swallowed. "So what do we do?" Jack watched the bear, studying the tension in her stance, the way her massive body trembled with exhaustion, but never faltered in its task. "We wait," he said. "She's not our enemy. But if we're not careful, we'll become hers." The sun had dipped lower in the sky, the golden hues of late afternoon bleeding into the cool grays of approaching dusk. Cody was still at it, her massive paws working with unwavering determination, but she was weakening. The signs were clear, her movements less forceful, her breath more labored. Jack couldn't watch any longer. He slung his rifle across his back, a deliberate move to show he wasn't here for a fight. Then, without a word, he rose from his crouch and took his first step forward. Cody let out a guttural snarl, her body stiffening, her powerful shoulders squared against the threat. Jack held his ground. The key wasn't to show dominance. It wasn't about proving strength. It was about trust. Jack stopped just a few yards away, lowering himself to one knee. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the binoculars around his neck and lifted them not toward Cody, but toward the hole she had been digging so fiercely. What he saw made his stomach tighten. A cub, barely visible beneath the tangled roots and layers of disturbed earth. A small bundle of fur lay motionless. Cody let out another warning growl. But this one was different, not as sharp, not as aggressive. It was a growl filled with something else entirely. Desperation. Jack's heart clenched. The cub was alive, but barely. He turned his head slightly, whispering over his shoulder to Emily. "It's her cub. It's trapped." Emily inhaled sharply. Jesus. Jack didn't wait for further discussion. His instincts had already taken over. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, he reached out a hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled not toward Cody, but toward the cub. The mother bear's breathing grew heavier, her nostrils flaring. She was watching his every move, measuring him. Jack didn't break eye contact. Not until Cody made her decision. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she moved, not away, but aside. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jack saw it. She shifted her massive body just enough to give him access to the cub. It was the only invitation he was going to get. Jack moved swiftly but carefully, his hands breaking through the loose dirt, freeing the cub's tiny frame. The moment his fingers brushed against its fur, a weak, whimpering cry escaped its mouth. Cody let out a deep, shuddering exhale, her ears flicking forward. Jack gently lifted the cub, cradling its frail body in his rough, calloused hands. The thing was barely breathing, its small chest rising and falling in weak, shallow gasps. "She's alive," Jack murmured. He turned the cub slightly, brushing away clumps of soil, feeling the faint warmth of life still clinging to it. Cody huffed softly, a sound of relief. Jack knew better than to hold the cub for long. Carefully, he lowered it to the ground before Cody, then took a step back, giving her space. The massive bear wasted no time. She bent down, nudging her cub with her nose, letting out low, comforting rumbles. She licked its tiny face, her massive frame curling around it protectively. Jack stepped back further, watching the silent exchange between mother and child. Emily let out a breath beside him. "I can't believe she let you do that." Jack didn't answer. He just stood there, watching. Something had shifted. Not just in Cody, but in him. He had stepped into the clearing as a hunter. He wasn't so sure that's who he was anymore. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The crisp air thick with anticipation. The mother bear, Cody, had just given him a sliver of trust, a gesture so rare, so unthinkable in the wild, that it felt almost sacred. The cub, now fully uncovered from its entrapment, lay motionless in the dirt. Its fur was damp, matted with soil, its small body barely rising and falling with each labored breath. It was alive, but only just. Jack swallowed, instinctively shrugging off his heavy flannel jacket. The cold mountain air bit at his skin, but he ignored it. The cub needed warmth more than he did. Cody let out a low, throaty sound as Jack moved closer, not quite a growl, but a warning nonetheless. He raised both hands, slow and deliberate, letting her see that he meant no harm. "Easy, girl," Jack murmured, his voice low and steady. "I'm just trying to help." The grizzly's massive shoulders tensed, her dark eyes locked onto his every move. Jack knew one wrong gesture could mean disaster, but something deep in his gut told him he had to act fast. He carefully wrapped his jacket around the cub's frail body, cradling it with practiced hands, as if handling something as fragile as glass. The cub let out a weak, pitiful whimper. Cody immediately responded, lowering her great head and sniffing at the bundle in Jack's arms. The warm gust of her breath sent a chill down his spine. Her black nose brushed against his fingers, so close that if she decided he was a threat, there'd be no escaping her wrath. Jack stood frozen, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Cody stepped back. It wasn't an act of submission, nor was it full surrender, but it was permission. Jack exhaled slowly. That was all he needed. A race against time. Jack turned toward Emily, who was still crouched near the tree line, her tranquilizer gun gripped tightly in one hand. "We need to get this little guy warm now," Jack said, his voice sharper than before. Emily nodded, immediately stepping forward to examine the cub. "He's freezing," she muttered, running her fingers lightly over the small bundle of fur. "Jack, if he doesn't get his body temp up, he won't make it." Jack already knew that. Cody let out another deep, guttural sound, pacing back and forth near the hole she had dug. She didn't like this. Jack had spent his life around animals. He understood them in ways most people didn't. And he knew exactly what this mother was feeling right now. She was torn between instinct and reason. Her body screamed at her to take her cub back, to keep him close, to shield him from anything that wasn't her. But something in her understood that she couldn't help him alone. Jack crouched down, keeping his movements slow, calculated, non-threatening. He unwrapped the cub slightly and placed his rough, calloused hand against its tiny ribs. So small, so fragile. The heartbeat beneath his palm was faint, too faint. Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't have time to hesitate. "He needs heat," Jack muttered. "The only thing keeping him going right now is adrenaline." Emily immediately unclipped the thick, insulated emergency blanket from her pack and handed it to Jack. He carefully wrapped it around the cub, tucking it securely inside his jacket. The little bear didn't protest, too weak to fight, too cold to care. Cody let out another sharp huff, stepping forward slightly. Jack stood his ground. "You're doing everything you can," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "Let me do my part." The mother bear's muscles tensed, her breath coming out in visible puffs of warm air against the cold. But she didn't attack. Jack saw it in her eyes, the battle between trust and fear. And then, Cody let out a low, grumbling exhale and stepped back. Not far, not all the way, but enough. Jack nodded once, acknowledging what she had just given him, what she had just allowed. "Let's move," he murmured to Emily, his pulse pounding in his ears. They needed to get back to the cabin. Fast. The journey back. The hike felt like the longest of Jack's life. The cub barely stirred inside his jacket. He kept one firm hand pressed against its tiny ribs, feeling the weak but steady pulse beneath. "Just hold on, little guy." Emily walked ahead, her radio crackling with static as she sent a message back to the ranger station. "I need a heads up on bear cub emergency care," she said. "Got one in critical condition." Jack focused on his footing, stepping carefully over frost-covered roots and patches of ice. The last thing he needed was to trip and make things worse. Cody followed behind them, not too close, but never far away. Her presence was a silent warning. Jack was carrying her whole world inside his jacket. He understood. If someone had taken his child from him, he'd do the same damn thing. As they reached the edge of the tree line, Jack's cabin came into view, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The sight brought a wave of relief he hadn't realized he was waiting for. "Inside," he said, stepping onto the porch. Emily threw the door open, and Jack strode straight to the fireplace, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. He kneeled down, holding the cub closer to the heat, rubbing gentle circles along its tiny body. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on, kid." A minute passed. Then two. Then a tiny sound. A soft, weak, almost inaudible whimper. Emily's head snapped up. Jack let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The cub was alive. For now. A mother's watchful eyes outside. A shadow moved along the tree line. Cody stood just beyond the clearing, her massive form silhouetted against the last light of dusk. Jack knew she wouldn't leave. Not until she knew her cub would survive. Jack exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together, then gently stroking the cub's small head. "You're one lucky little guy," he muttered. "Your mama wasn't giving up on you. Neither was he." And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt something shift inside him. This was more than just saving a bear. This was about something bigger. Something he wasn't ready to put into words just yet. But he would. Soon. Jack Carter had never cared much for attachments. People came and went, and he preferred it that way. Life in the mountains had suited him because it meant no obligations, no expectations, just him and the wild. But as he sat by the crackling fire in his cabin, watching over the fragile bundle of fur in his arms, something inside him had begun to shift. The cub Cody was still weak, but he was fighting. His tiny breaths came shallow and uneven, but he was breathing. That alone was a victory. Jack had placed him in a makeshift nest of blankets by the hearth, rubbing his small body gently with a dry towel to work some warmth back into his limbs. The emergency milk formula Emily had mixed up earlier had been accepted barely, but it was a start. Now, all they could do was wait. A mother's vigil. Jack stood up and stretched, rolling the stiffness out of his shoulders, then walked to the small window facing the tree line. Cody was still out there. Even in the darkness, he could make out her massive silhouette between the trees, her dark eyes reflecting the cabin light. She wasn't leaving. She wouldn't. Jack understood her instinct to stay. If it had been his son in there, in the hands of some unknown force, he would have burned down the whole damn forest before walking away. The thought made his chest tighten, a pang of something old, something buried. He shoved the feeling aside and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold was sharper now, the night air filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from the chair near the door and walked a few steps toward the tree line. Cody let out a low growl as he approached. Jack stopped, hands open. "Easy, girl." He crouched and placed the blanket down on the ground, a few feet between them. "It's gonna be a long night," he murmured. "Might as well be warm." She huffed but didn't retreat. Jack nodded to himself, then turned back toward the cabin. It was strange, this unspoken truce between them. A week ago, he wouldn't have believed it possible. And yet here they were. The long night. Jack settled back into his chair, keeping one ear tuned to the cub's slow, steady breathing. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. But he didn't dare close his eyes just yet. Emily had left an hour ago, promising to check in at sunrise. She didn't say it outright, but Jack knew she was worried about him. Hell, maybe he was worried about himself. The firelight flickered, casting shadows against the wooden walls. Jack stared into the flames, his mind drifting to another winter, another fire, a much younger version of himself curled up under a heavy wool blanket, while his father sat across from him, silent, brooding, distant. He could still hear his old man's gruff voice. "A man's gotta know what he stands for, Jack." The world doesn't care about you. You take what you need, and you don't waste a second feeling bad about it. Jack had believed that for a long time. Until now. He looked down at Cody, the small cub curled against the thick folds of fabric, his tiny body rising and falling in quiet rhythm. This wasn't about taking. This was about giving something back. Jack exhaled slowly. He wasn't the same man he had been yesterday. Maybe he never would be again. Morning's light, the first light of dawn, broke through the trees, casting a pale glow across the frost-covered earth. Jack had barely slept, but his mind felt sharper than it had in years. Cody stirred. Jack's breath caught as the cub shifted slightly, his small limbs stretching under the warmth of the blankets. His movements were still weak, but there was a strength returning, a flicker of fight in him. "Look at you," Jack murmured. "Tough little guy, aren't you?" Cody let out a soft, sleepy huff, then snuggled deeper into the nest of blankets. Jack smirked. "Damn stubborn. Just like his mother." Speaking of which, Jack pushed to his feet and moved toward the window. Cody was still there. She was pacing now, her massive form cutting through the mist. Waiting, watching, worrying. Jack understood. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. Cody stopped pacing the second he appeared. Jack held up his hands, palms open. "He's all right," he said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "You did good, girl. You kept him alive." Cody let out a low sound, something between a growl and a sigh. Jack hesitated. There was still the question of what came next. Cody was still weak. If they'd just let him go now, he might not make it. But keeping him here too long? That wasn't an option either. Jack let out a slow breath, looking from the cub inside to the mother bear outside. One way or another, a decision had to be made. An unspoken understanding. Jack spent the rest of the morning tending to Cody, feeding him a little more milk, checking his breathing. Every so often, he'd glance out the window, making sure Cody was still there. She always was. By midday, Emily had returned. "You look like hell," she greeted, stepping inside. Jack chuckled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Feel like it, too." Emily crouched near the cub. "He's looking better." Jack nodded. "He's getting stronger." A pause. Then, "You know what this means, right?" Emily asked quietly. Jack did. It meant they had to figure out how to reunite him with Cody before it was too late. Jack glanced toward the tree line, where Cody still waited. He didn't know how long she would stay there. He didn't know if she truly trusted him, or if she was simply desperate enough to let him do what she couldn't. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep Cody forever. Jack let out a slow breath and nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I know." And for the first time in his life, Jack Carter knew exactly what he stood for. The days that followed felt like a strange, delicate dance, one that neither man nor beast had ever rehearsed. Cody, once weak and barely clinging to life, was growing stronger. His breaths came easier, his tiny limbs moved with more purpose, and his once dull eyes now held the flicker of awareness. He still wasn't out of the woods, not yet, but he was fighting. And so was his mother. Cody never left. Jack watched her from the window each morning, a towering shadow just beyond the tree line. She was always there, waiting, watching, protecting, even if from a distance. Jack understood that. He wasn't much different himself. Morning rituals and unspoken promises every morning. Before the sun had fully climbed over the ridge, Jack would step outside with a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a wool blanket in the other. He'd set the blanket down near the clearing's edge, just far enough to be a peace offering, but close enough that Cody wouldn't see it as a trap. She never took it while he was watching. But by the next morning, it was always gone. Jack smirked to himself every time. Stubborn old girl. Emily came by daily, checking in on Cody and, though she'd never admit it, on Jack, too. "He's got more strength in him," she remarked on the fourth morning, watching as Cody clumsily pawed at a piece of firewood near the hearth. Jack nodded. "He's getting there." But it wasn't just Cody who had changed. Something in Jack felt different, too. Maybe it was the way he caught himself checking the window every few minutes, making sure Cody was still there. Maybe it was the way he kept the fire going longer than usual, just so the cabin would stay warm for the little cub curled up near it. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. The first steps. By the sixth day, Cody was ready to move beyond the blankets. Jack took him outside for the first time. bundling him in one of the thick furs from the cabin. The cub squirmed against his chest, his small claws gripping Jack's sleeve with surprising strength. Cody was there, of course. She emerged from the trees the second Jack stepped onto the porch, her massive form tensed with anticipation. Jack stopped a good 20 feet from her, lowering himself onto one knee, as he gently set Cody down. The cub sniffed at the crisp morning air, his tiny body wobbling slightly before finding its balance. Cody let out a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a call. Something in between. Cody turned at the sound but didn't move toward her. Jack's stomach twisted. The cub had been away too long. For the first time, Jack felt the weight of his role in this. He had saved Cody, yes. But had he also broken something in the process? The bond between mother and child was a fragile, sacred thing. Had he taken too much time? Had he given Cody just enough human comfort to make him hesitate? Jack looked at Cody, really looked at her. The raw desperation in her eyes had faded, but the worry remained. She didn't step forward. She was waiting. For him. Jack swallowed hard, then placed a gentle hand on Cody's small back, nudging him forward just slightly. Go on, kid. She's been waiting for you. Cody hesitated, then took one unsteady step, then another, and another. Cody let out a softer sound this time, something deep, almost mournful. But Cody didn't run to her, not yet. Instead, the cub turned back toward Jack and let out a tiny, uncertain chirp. Jack felt something in his chest tighten, and for a second, he almost called him back. Almost. But this wasn't about Jack. This was about Cody. About where he truly belonged. Jack exhaled and stood. It's all right, little guy, he murmured, though the words weren't just for Cody. You know where to go. The weight of letting go that night. Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames but seeing something else entirely. Cody had stayed close to the porch most of the day, never venturing far. But Cody had waited, patient and unmoving, until the sun had started to set. That was when Cody finally made his choice. Jack had watched as the small cub ambled toward the tree line, pausing just inches from Cody's enormous paws. Cody had lowered her head, nuzzling him with a tenderness Jack hadn't expected from something so powerful. Then, with a final glance back toward the cabin, they had disappeared into the trees. Jack had stood on the porch for a long time after that, the cold air pressing in around him. The emptiness hit harder than he thought it would. Cody was gone. Cody too. And yet the clearing didn't feel empty. It felt right. Jack took a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. You all right? Emily's voice startled him from his thoughts. He glanced up to see her standing in the doorway, arms crossed. He huffed. Do I look all right? She smirked. Not really. Jack exhaled, then nodded toward the window. They're gone. Emily followed his gaze, then nodded. That's what was supposed to happen, Jack. He knew that. Of course he knew that. But still it didn't make the silence any easier. What remains as the fire burned low, Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the empty blankets near the hearth. He had spent so many years alone. And for the most part, he had been all right with that. But now? Now there was a space where something else had been. Not just the cub. Not just Cody. Something inside him. Jack let out a breath and stood, crossing the room to the wooden rifle rack above the mantel. His hand hovered over it. Then, slowly for the first time in years he took it down. Not to use. Just to put it away. Somewhere out there, Kodi and Cody were moving deeper into the wild, carving out a new path. Maybe it was time Jack did the same. As he stood there, the firelight casting long shadows against the walls, he realized something. The wild didn't just change the ones who lived in it. Sometimes, it changed the ones who had only ever watched. The morning air carried a sharpness that cut through the trees, a quiet whisper of the coming winter. Jack felt it the moment he stepped onto the porch, the cold biting at his skin through his flannel shirt. The clearing lay just beyond the tree line, where Kodi and Cody had stayed for nearly 2 weeks. Each day, Jack had come, bringing food, fresh blankets, and whatever small offering he could manage. He had watched as Cody grew stronger, watched as Cody remained ever vigilant, always standing between her cub and the world. But today, something was different. Jack could feel it before he even saw them. The woods were too quiet. There was no rustling of branches, no soft huffs of breath in the cold air. The space where they had been was empty. Cody was gone. And so was Cody. A change in the air. Jack exhaled, his breath clouding in the cold morning light. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the frozen grass, as he approached the place where they had last slept. The blankets he had left were still there but untouched. The faint indentations of Cody's massive paws were scattered in the dirt, but they didn't circle back as they usually did. They led one direction. Away. Jack's stomach clenched. He had known this day would come. It was supposed to come. Still, it didn't make the clearing feel any less empty. It didn't make the silence any less loud. Jack ran a hand over his beard, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see the familiar golden-brown shape of Cody watching him from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the trees. Just the wind. Just him. A trail to follow. Jack crouched, running his fingers through the disturbed dirt where Cody had been lying just the night before. The ground was still slightly warm beneath the surface. They hadn't been gone long. His eyes followed the tracks leading away from the clearing, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. For a moment, he debated following them. He could track them. He knew these woods better than anyone. He could find them before they went too far. But what then? Would he try to bring Cody back? Hold on just a little longer. Jack clenched his jaw. No. That wasn't his place. Cody had done what she was always going to do. She had waited until Cody was strong enough. Then she had taken him back to where he belonged. She had stayed as long as she needed. And now, she was gone. That was how it was supposed to be. Even if it didn't feel right. Jack let out a slow breath, rising to his feet. He took one last look at the empty clearing, then turned back toward the cabin. The weight of goodbye. Back at the cabin, the silence followed him. Jack went through the motions, stoking the fire, heating a pot of coffee, sitting in his chair by the window. But it wasn't the same. For the past few weeks, his mornings had started with something else. A quiet, expectant moment just before dawn when he'd step onto the porch, coffee in hand, knowing Cody would be there. Even if she kept her distance, even if she never took a step closer, she had been there. And now, she wasn't. Jack took a slow sip of coffee, his fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. The warmth didn't reach his chest the way it usually did. A visit from Emily. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled Jack from his thoughts. Emily's truck rolled to a stop outside, her familiar Green Ranger uniform standing out against the muted colors of the forest. She stepped out, her breath visible in the cold air. Jack didn't bother getting up. She let herself in, brushing the chill off her sleeves as she glanced around the cabin. Her eyes landed on the empty blankets near the hearth. They're gone, aren't they? Jack nodded. Sometime last night. Emily sighed, running a hand through her ponytail. You knew this was coming. Yeah. You all right? Jack didn't answer right away. Was he? His chest felt hollow, like something had been scooped out and left behind. He wasn't sure if that was grief or something else. Finally, he exhaled. I will be. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. You did good, Jack. Jack let out a low chuckle. Did I? Emily smirked. Cody trusted you. That means something. Jack looked away, his jaw tightening. She didn't have a choice, maybe at first. But later. She could have left sooner. She didn't. Jack turned that over in his mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe Cody hadn't just been waiting for Cody to get stronger. Maybe she had been waiting for something else too. Jack didn't know what that meant. And maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that Cody was alive. What mattered was that he was with his mother, where he was meant to be. Jack took another sip of coffee, letting the silence settle between them. Emily didn't push. She just sat down across from him, watching the fire as it burned lower in the hearth. A new path later that evening. After Emily had left, Jack found himself standing in front of the fireplace, staring at the empty rifle rack. For years, that rifle had been the one constant in his life. A tool, a habit, a purpose. But now, Jack wasn't so sure it belonged there anymore. He reached for it not to use, not even to put it back on the wall. Just to hold it. The weight in his hands felt different now. Lighter. Or maybe it was he who had changed. Jack ran his fingers along the polished wood, then slowly, deliberately set it aside. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the trees swayed gently in the wind. Somewhere out there, Kodi and Cody were walking their own path, just as they always had. Jack took a slow breath, then turned away from the rifle. Maybe it was time he did the same. The first snowfall of the season came just before dawn. Jack Carter woke to the soft hush of flakes drifting past his cabin window, layering the world in a fresh coat of white. The sight should have been familiar, comforting even. But this winter felt different. Kodi and Cody were gone. The clearing beyond the trees lay empty, no longer holding the warmth of their quiet presence. Jack had spent weeks visiting, hoping to catch some sign of them. But the forest had swallowed them whole, leaving only the memory of their time together. He hadn't realized how much he would miss them. With a sigh, Jack pulled on his heavy flannel, stoked the fire, and poured himself a cup of coffee. The warmth spread through his fingers, but it didn't quite reach the cold knot in his chest. Somewhere out there, Cody was learning how to survive. And Jack? For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what came next. A life left behind. Jack stepped onto the porch, watching the snowflakes dance in the morning light. The rifle rack inside the cabin was empty now. He had moved the gun out of sight weeks ago. Not because he wanted to forget, but because it no longer felt like a part of who he was. Hunting had once been his entire identity. But standing there in the cold, he saw the world through different eyes. The forest had given him so much purpose, peace, even clarity. But it had also forced him to face a truth he had spent years avoiding. He had been taking for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to give. Cody had reminded him. And Cody, well, Cody had changed him. Jack ran a hand through his beard, exhaling deeply. It was time for something new. A visit from Emily. The sound of a truck rolling up the path broke through his thoughts. Jack didn't have to look to know who it was. Emily Green stepped out of her Ranger truck, her boots crunching against the freshly fallen snow. She carried a thermos in one hand, a knowing smile on her face. "You gonna invite me in, Carter? Or should I just leave this coffee on the porch?" Jack smirked, motioning her inside. Wouldn't say no to a good cup of coffee. She stepped in, shaking the snow off her jacket, and poured 2 cups, before sitting across from him by the fire. Jack noticed how she studied him carefully, watching, waiting. Finally, she spoke. "You thinking about leaving?" Jack blinked. "What makes you say that?" Emily shrugged. "Been a ranger long enough to recognize when someone's at a crossroads." Jack stared at the fire, swirling the coffee in his cup. "She wasn't wrong. I don't know," he admitted. "I spent most of my life hunting out here. Then, things changed." Emily leaned back, sipping her coffee. "So? What do you want to do now?" Jack let the question settle between them. What did he want? For so long, his answer would have been simple. Hunt. Live alone. Keep moving forward the only way he knew how. But now, Jack thought of Cody, the way the cub had fought to survive despite the odds stacked against him. He thought of Cody, how she had trusted him, how she had let him get close when everything in her nature told her not to. He thought of the man he had been before that day in the woods. "I want to do something different," Jack finally said. Emily smiled, as if she had already known his answer. A new purpose. A week later, Jack packed up the cabin. Not everything, just enough. A few clothes, his journal, his boots, and the old binoculars his father had left him. Things he could carry forward. The rifle stayed behind. The last thing Jack did before leaving was step onto the porch one last time, his eyes scanning the snow-covered trees. He knew he wouldn't see them again, but maybe that was okay. Cody had given him something far more valuable than just an encounter. She had given him direction. He took a deep breath, then turned toward the truck waiting on the dirt path. Emily stood by the driver's side, arms crossed, watching as Jack approached. She smirked. "Didn't think you'd actually do it." Jack chuckled. "Me neither." She tossed him a Ranger jacket. "Try it on. It suits you." Jack hesitated before slipping it over his shoulders. It felt right. The fabric was thick, sturdy, made for someone who belonged out here. Someone who wasn't just passing through. Emily patted him on the back. "Come on, Carter. Time to put that stubborn nature of yours to good use." Jack smirked, stepping into the truck. As they drove down the mountain road, he took one last glance at the towering pines disappearing into the distance. For the first time in years, he wasn't leaving something behind. He was heading toward something new. Epilogue. The call of the wild. Months passed. Seasons changed. Jack Carter had spent decades hunting in the wilderness. Now, He protected it. As a ranger, his life was no longer about taking from the forest, it was about preserving it. He learned to track, not to kill, but to understand. To ensure that animals like Kodi and Cody had the space to live, to thrive. He never saw them again. But sometimes, on cold winter mornings, he would find fresh bear tracks near his cabin. And on those mornings, Jack would step onto his porch, sip his coffee, and nod toward the trees. Because deep down, he knew, Cody remembered him, too. Jack Carter's journey is more than just a story about a hunter and a bear. It's a powerful lesson on transformation, trust, and finding new purpose in life. For years, Jack saw the wilderness as a place to hunt, a battleground where survival meant taking. But when he encountered Kodi and Cody, everything changed. Through them, he learned that life isn't just about what we take, it's about what we give back. Many of us spend our years following a path we believe is set in stone. But just like Jack, there comes a moment when we realize it's never too late to change, to find meaning in something new, to shift from a mindset of survival to one of stewardship. For those in their golden years, Jack's story reminds us that growth doesn't stop with age. Purpose isn't tied to what we used to do, it's tied to what we choose to do now. No matter where you are in life, there's always a chance to redefine yourself. Sometimes, all it takes is a moment of connection or reason to step forward into something greater. Jack's journey reminds us that change is always possible, no matter where we are in life. It's never too late to find a new purpose, to give back, and to see the world through a different lens. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales of friendship, loyalty, and redemption.